The thing that concerns me most in this legislation is compelled speech. I think that's very concerning. And in my opinion, when we look to the provincial definitions set up by the commissions, we are enshrining the theory of a gender spectrum into the law. I wonder if you can comment on that.
That's exactly what we're doing. And I think that might even be more dangerous than, in my opinion, than the compelled speech issue, because the social constructionist view of gender isn't another opinion, it's just wrong. So, because, and I can tell you why that is fairly, I'll take 1 minute to do that.
Please.
Well, the proposition that's instantiated, for example, in this particular visual, which is a good representation of the philosophy of the policies, is that there's no causal relationship between these 4 dimensions of identity, and that's palpably absurd. I mean, 98% of people, it's 99.7% of people who inhabit a body with a given biological sex identify with that biological sex. They're incredibly tightly linked. If you can't attribute causality to a link that's that tight, you have to dispense with the notion of causality altogether. And then of the people who identify, say, as male or female, who are also biologically male or female, the vast majority of them have the sexual preference that would go along with that, and the gender identity, and the gender expression. These levels of analysis are unbelievably tightly linked, and the evidence that biological factors play a role in determining gender identity is, in a word, overwhelming. There isn't a serious scientist alive who would dispute that. Now, you get disputes about it, but they always stem from, essentially, from the humanities. And as far as I'm concerned, I've looked at it very carefully. Those arguments are entirely ideologically driven. It's a tenet of the ideology that identity is socially constructed, and that's partly why it's been instantiated into law, because there's no way they're going to win the argument. But they can certainly win, let's say, the propaganda war, especially by foisting this sort of reprehensible advertising information on children, and that's part of the express intent.
This business has to wax lady balls. A Windsor business specializing in body hair removal is facing a Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario complaint after the alleged denial of service to a transgender woman. When the manager, Jason Carruthers, returned her call, the complainant alleges he advised that Mad Wax does not provide waxing services to men, and that his waxer is a Muslim woman who is not comfortable waxing male parts. Carruthers also indicated no other staff were available to perform the request. The complainant claims to have offered to educate the manager on his duty to accommodate, then sought waxing services elsewhere. This Zerson will win their case. In Canada, gender identity is protected under the same human rights laws as race or disability. Gender identity may or may not conform to a person's birth-assigned sex. Now, this article concerns employment law, but provides some terms and conditions which are legally relevant. On June 19, 2017, 5 years after gender identity and gender expression were added as protected grounds of discrimination in Ontario's Human Rights Code, the federal government has added gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act. All Canadian provinces now have a gender identity and/or gender expression expressly included in their human rights legislation, yet many employers are still unclear as to what they need to do to respect the human rights of their transgendered or gender non-conforming employees. The uncertainty around employers' obligations may be partially attributable to the fact that neither gender identity nor gender expression are defined in the legislation. Gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It is their sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. Gender expression is how a person publicly presents their gender. This can include behavior and outward appearance such as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice. Trans or transgender, gender non-conforming individuals. General obligations. The practical implications of an employer's duty to protect against discrimination on the basis of gender identity and expression, and the corresponding duty to accommodate, are evolving as the legislation is interpreted. At this stage, it's clear that employers' responsibilities arise at all stages of employment, from hiring to termination. An individualized gender transition accommodation plan is suggested to enable the employee, employer, and union representative, where the employee is asked for the union's involvement, to work together during the transition process. Open communication with the employee is essential when drawing up an individualized accommodation plan. The employee's preferences should be determined and respected wherever possible. Now we can take most of this and apply it also to customers. The Ontario Human Rights Act is vaguely specific. Under the Ontario Human Rights Code, discrimination and harassment because of gender identity or gender expression is against the law. Everyone should be able to have the same opportunities and benefits, and be treated with equal dignity and respect, including transgender, transsexual, and intersex persons, cross-dressers, and other people whose gender identity and expression is or is seen to be different from their birth sex. This shopkeeper will lose the case. The law is clear. They must take on the tranny testes. If you like this video, check out my other video, Equity Means More Than Equality, Human Rights Act Canada, which looks into how the Employment Equity Act of Canada and the Human Rights Act systematically exclude straight white men, allowing and even mandating discrimination against those groups.
I felt really bad for that lady who applied and got kicked out because of that, because she checked that she's white Caucasian and because she's a woman. But that is something that I think a lot of visible minority Canadians face all the time. May not be as blatant, as direct,